It began not with a single battle, but with an idea, the belief that ordinary people had the right to govern themselves. In the mid-1700s, the 13 British colonies in North America were growing fast, rich in trade, resources, and ambition. But across the ocean, in London, decisions were being made that shaped their lives without their consent. The colonies paid taxes to Britain, followed British laws, and fought in Britain's wars. Yet, they had no voice in Parliament. To them, it felt unjust, a system that took their wealth but ignored their will. No taxation without representation. That became their rallying cry, simple words that carried revolutionary fire. Everything changed in 1765 when Britain introduced the Stamp Act, forcing colonists to pay taxes on printed documents. Protests erupted. Merchants refused British goods. Pamphlets and speeches spread through the colonies like wildfire, demanding liberty. But Britain answered with more control, new taxes, stricter trade laws, and troops sent to enforce them. Tension turned to anger, and anger to defiance. In 1770, British soldiers fired on protesting colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. 5 men killed, but their deaths sparked something far greater: unity. The colonies began to see themselves not as separate territories, but as one people under pressure. 3 years later, in 1773, came the Boston Tea Party, when American patriots, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and threw chests of tea into the harbor, rejecting British taxes once again. Britain retaliated with harsh punishments, closing Boston's port and tightening control. But instead of breaking the colonies, it united them. By 1775, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord. Farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, ordinary people, stood against one of the strongest empires in the world. They were called Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. Few had uniforms or proper weapons, but they had something far more powerful: conviction. In Philadelphia, 1776, the leaders of the colonies gathered to make a historic decision. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was signed, written largely by Thomas Jefferson. It declared that all men are created equal and that governments derive power from the consent of the governed. It was an act of courage and treason in the eyes of Britain. The war that followed tested every promise of that declaration. For 8 long years, America fought battles across towns, valleys, and rivers, often outnumbered, gunned, but never outwilled, under the leadership of General George Washington. The Continental Army endured brutal winters, scarce supplies, and crushing defeats. But they kept going, because they weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for a future. In 1781, the turning point came at Yorktown, Virginia, when American and French forces surrounded the British Army led by General Cornwallis. With nowhere left to escape, Britain surrendered. The war was over. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. What began as protests had become a nation free, self-governed, and built on the belief that liberty belongs to the people. But independence wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The new country still faced questions of unity, equality, and identity that would take centuries to answer. Yet, the spirit born in that revolution, the courage to stand for freedom, continues to define America to this day. Because independence isn't just something you win once. It's something you defend, believe in, and live for every single generation. Count words and characters.